بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So today is lesson number 17 in the section on Al-Qadr and Al-Shar', Al-Qadr and the legislation, and it is lesson 52 overall in the series. So just to recap, I know we've had a break for a couple of weeks. Just to recap then, so the second half of the book, we are looking at Al-Qadr, the divine decree, and the legislation, the Sharia, and how there can be no contradiction between the two. So we looked at Al-Qadr first of all. We defined what is Al-Qadr. It is Allah's prior knowledge of all things, and that He created all things by way of, or He put in all things asbab, which are the ways and the means. And things happen in Allah's creation by way of these ways and means. And He knows everything that is to happen or has happened at the precise moment it is to happen. And, He wills it and He creates it through the asbab, which He's put within His creation. So this is Al-Qadr, and we have to believe in Al-Qadr, and we have to believe in the asbab, in the ways and means, because this is part and parcel of tawakkul, which is relying upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, taking the means and then leaving the outcome to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because there are the results are in His hands, because He is the controller of all things and the knower of all things. At the same time, Allah Azza wa Jal, He sent down legislations. He sent down the Torah. The major legislations are the Torah of Musa alayhi salam and the Sharia of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and there are other legislations as well. And so these legislations and what they contain of the halal and the haram, that which is wajib, that which is obligatory, that which is prohibited, unlawful, or that which is disliked, or that which is commended. All of these affairs, they are on the basis of what Allah created. Allah legislates on the basis of what He created, right? So within His creation, there are things which are wholesome and pure, beneficial to eat, to drink, to consume, to wear. So Allah made that halal, and because it's tayyib and it's halal. And there are things which are filthy and vile and harmful and corrupt. And so Allah made that to be unlawful. Allah prohibited that and made that to be unlawful. And there are some things in which there is some benefit, but the harm is greater. So Allah made that unlawful because of the greater harm. And there are some things where the benefit is overwhelming, and so He made that permissible or commendable, right? So the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can never ever contradict Al-Qadr, right? From one angle, in the sense that from Al-Qadr is whatever Allah created of things, of entities, of their attributes, right? So the halal and the haram, the beneficial and the harmful, the wajib and the prohibited, all of that agrees completely with what Allah created. Now, at the same time, when it comes to actions and behaviors, likewise, from the actions and behaviors and the statements and likewise the feelings of the heart, there is within them that which is harmful, corrupt, evil. For example, there is jealousy, for example. There could be, for example, anger out of its place. Then there are statements which are harmful. Then there are actions and behaviors which are harmful, like stealing, for example, like lying, for example. So the Sharia has come to prohibit that which is harmful and corrupt, and to enjoin that which is beneficial, right? So this means that there can never ever be any contradiction between the Sharia and Al-Qadr, whatever Allah has created, inclusive of the ways and the means. So once all of that is clear, built upon this are certain misconceptions that people might have regarding Al-Qadr. So they might say, for example, well, if Allah's decreed, for me to go to hell or to paradise, then what's the benefit? What's the purpose in acting? Right? This question is baseless, because just as a person, will not remove his hunger or his thirst by drinking or by eating, which is from the ways and means, then similarly Allah has made ways and means for you to enter paradise. So you by necessity you have to take those ways and means, right? So you can't say, well, if I'm written to go to paradise, then I'll go to paradise anyway. It's no different to saying that, well, if I'm going to die of starvation, well, I'm going to die of starvation. What's the point of me eating anything to remove my starvation? Because it can happen anyway, right? So we looked at all of the false and corrupt reasoning, the incoherence, the contradiction in this way of thinking. We looked at all of the kind of shubuhat in all of that. And after all of that discussion, we then moved into the Sharia, right? So what is the Sharia? And we said that the Sharia, the foundation of it is Islam, the general Islam that all the prophets and messengers call to. And as for the specific Islam, this applies to the Sharia of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And from there we started looking at, okay, so what is Islam? What does it mean? It is, submission to Allah, inward and outward. So the foundation of Islam obviously is Tawheed. And so our discussion would not be complete without a discussion of Tawheed itself, because it's the foundation of Islam, foundation of the Sharia. So over the previous lessons, we looked at how do the people of the Sunnah, how do they understand Tawheed? What is the correct understanding? So we established there is Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, that Allah exists, He's the Lord, He is unique in creating, providing, owning, giving life, taking life. No one really denied a creator in the whole history of mankind. Not even Fir'aun, and so we looked at that. That isn't what the messengers called to. It wasn't the dispute between them and their people. So after that we looked at Uluhiyyah, which is singling out Allah in worship, and this was the point of dispute between the prophets and messengers and the people to whom they were sent. And this is always the point of contention. Either you are a slave to Allah, you are enslaved to Allah, or you are enslaved to other than Allah. There's only these two things. And so every call, every invitation, every ideology, every ism, or whatever there might be, which is out there, other than the call of the prophets and messengers, then that is leading you to enslavement to other than Allah. Right? It's only the call of the prophets and messengers that free you from slavery by making you enslaved only to Allah, your Lord and your Maker and your Creator. And so this uluhiyyah is the point of contention. It's the place of battle. It's where the battle lies in terms of knowledge and in terms of other affairs. And then we completed that discussion. There was actually many important points within that discussion. What is ibadah? What is the definition of ibadah? What are the types of ibadah? And we looked at all of that. And so we concluded our discussion in the previous lesson with looking at some aspects of worship, such as khawf and tawakkul and things like that. And we looked at them. And so this leads us now to today's lesson. From this point onwards, we're going to continue that discussion. So now we are looking at the third aspect of Tawheed, which is Tawheed al-Asma'i was-Sifat, which is how do we correctly believe in Allah's names and attributes, because that is part and parcel of Tawheed. Now this chapter that we are discussing, this is really basically a summary of the first half of the book. Right? So we've already covered Allah's names and His attributes in the first half of the book in detail. And so this short section, really, it kind of summarizes everything that we discussed before. So it's a nice reminder of the topic. And so we'll spend this lesson, hopefully, and complete it in this lesson, insha'Allah ta'ala. So the Shaykh, rahimahullah, he says, وَأَمَّا تَوْحِيدُ الْأَسْمَاءِ وَالصِّفَاتِ فَهُوَ إِفْرَادُ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى بِأَسْمَائِهِ وَصِفَاتِهِ. And he goes on to the end, I'll just translate it. As for Tawheed, that relates to His names and attributes, then it is to single out Allah with His names and His attributes. It is to single out Allah with His names and attributes. Right? So what are the three aspects of Tawheed? How can we succinctly and very concisely summarize each one? Let's go through each one. What is Tawheed al-Rububiyyah? Right? It is to single out Allah in His actions. Right? To single out Allah in His actions. What do we mean? We mean the actions of creating, the actions of giving life, the actions of taking life, the actions of providing, the actions of guiding and misguiding. Right? It is only Allah who does all of that. He is the creator, the maker, the provider, and so on and so forth. So everything we see, these are all the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in creating and maintaining and regulating the heavens and the earth. So there is no one from His creatures who does any of that. Not an angel, not a prophet, right? So this is Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. To single out Allah in His actions. Right? Very simple. And so this is as it relates to the actions of Allah. This is Rububiyyah, is the actions of Allah. Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah is to single out Allah in worship. This now is the actions of the servant. This is our actions, to unify our actions and to single them and to direct them only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of the actions which enter into worship, the actions of ibadah, right? Bowing, prostrating, invoking, supplicating, relying, fearing, hoping, and so on and so forth, right? So this is now, Tawheed is to single out Allah with one's actions of worship. And the third aspect of Tawheed is to single out Allah in His names and His attributes, right? To ascribe to Him or to give Him the names and the attributes that He has affirmed for Himself. And so, following on from this then, the Shaykh says, وَذَلِكَ بِإِثْبَاتِ مَا أَثْبَتَهُ اللَّهُ لِنَفْسِهِ مِنَ الْأَسْمَاءِ وَالصِّفَاتِ فِي كِتَابِهِ أو على لسان رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم من غير تحريف ولا تعطيل ولا تكييف ولا تمثيل. So we covered this before. It is to affirm for Allah what He affirmed for Himself of names and attributes in His book or upon the tongue of His messenger, without tahrif, distorting them, or ta'til, denying them, or takyif, asking how, or tamthil, which is likening them to those of the creation, right? So we've covered this before. You are familiar with all of these, these foundations. This is the essence of the position of Ahlus Sunnah when it comes to speaking about Allah's names and attributes. We affirm for Allah whatever He affirmed for Himself in His book or upon the tongue of His messenger. And we do that without falling into any of these four things, which is tahrif, to distort them, to distort their meanings, ta'til, which is to outright deny them, or to make takyif, which is to start specifying the how, or it is tamthil, which is to liken them to the attributes of the creation. The Shaykh then goes on to mention four things that it is impermissible for us to do, four things which is impermissible for us to do on the basis of what has just been mentioned. So he says, first of all, فَلَا يَجُوزُ نَفْيُ شَيْءٍ مما سمى الله به نفسه أو وصف به نفسه لقوله تعالى ولله الأسماء الحسنى فادعوه بها وَذَرُوا الَّذِينَ يُلْحِدُونَ فِي أَسْمَائِهِ سَيُجْزَوْنَ مَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. Right, so the first thing we cannot do, do not do, is that we cannot therefore deny anything that Allah has named Himself with, or which He described Himself with. Because Allah Azza wa Jal said in the Quran, to Allah belong the most beautiful names, so invoke Him by way of them. So call upon Allah by way of His names. Allah is Ar-Rahman, Allah is Ar-Rahim, Allah is Al-Ghaffar, Allah is Al-Ghafur. Right? So we ask Allah, Allah is Ar-Razzaq. So we invoke Allah by way of these names, which are suited and relevant to the things that we are asking Him for. فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا, so invoke Him by way of them. And leave alone those who deviate in respect to His names. They shall be recompensed with that which they used to do. So in other words, we believe in Allah, we believe in His names and attributes, we worship Him by way of them, and we turn away and we leave alone those who start delving, disputing, philosophizing, and rejecting His names and attributes, which is the way of the people of Kalam, the people of philosophy, the Jahmiyyah, people like them, and we have nothing to do with them. And the Shaykh mentioned this ayah as a proof that ta'til, or negating His attributes, that this is not permissible. It is prohibited. And then he says, وَلِأَنَّ ذَلِكَ تَعْطِيلٌ يَسْتَلْزِمُ تَحْرِيفَ النُّصُوص أو تَكْذِيبَهَا مع وصف الله تعالى بالنقائص والعيوب. So we have to affirm this for Allah, and we have to avoid making these types of denials, because ultimately this is going to lead to people distorting the texts and ascribing to Allah, with deficiencies and with shortcomings. Right? So that's the first thing that we are not allowed to do. We cannot deny anything from what Allah affirmed for Himself. The second thing that we cannot do, وَلَا يَجُوزُ تسمية الله تعالى أو وصفه بما لم يأتي في الكتاب والسنة. The second thing we can't do is to now start describing Allah or naming Allah with something that did not come in the book and the Sunnah. Right? For example, the Christians say about Allah that He is the Father. The Father. Well, there's nothing that has come in Revelation that Allah is the Father, right? In the Quran or the Sunnah. So we can't describe and name Allah with something that He didn't name and describe Himself with. The philosophers, they have certain names and titles that they use. The prime mover, like Aristotle, the prime mover. Okay, well, it's not one of his names, it's not one of his titles. So here, it's not permissible to name Allah the Exalted or to describe Him with what has not come in the book and the Sunnah. لأن ذلك قول على الله تعالى بلا علم. Because this is to speak about Allah without knowledge. And Allah said in the Quran, وقد قال الله تعالى, Allah said in Surah Al-A'raf, chapter 7, verse 33, say, قل إنما حرم ربي الفواحش. Say, my Lord has prohibited the shameful deeds, ما ظهر منها وما بطن, those which are apparent and those which are inward and hidden, والإثم والبغي بغير الحق. And likewise, He prohibited sin and transgression without right, وأن تشركوا بالله ما لم ينزل به سلطانا, and that you associate with Allah partners for which He gave you no authority, وأن تقولوا على الله ما لا تعلمون, and that you say upon Allah that of which you have no knowledge. Right? There are four prohibitions mentioned in this verse. The first thing is shameful deeds, what is open and what is hidden. Secondly, sin and transgression. Thirdly, to commit shirk with Allah. And fourthly, to say about Allah that of which you have no knowledge. To speak about Allah without knowledge. Right? So this is from the greatest of evils which are prohibited. And also another verse in Surah Al-Isra, chapter 17, verse 36, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ. Do not pursue that of which you have no knowledge. إن السمع والبصر والفؤاد كل أولئك كان عنه مسؤولا. Indeed, the hearing and the seeing and the heart, all of that will be inquired into. Right? So these two verses are a proof to show that we are prohibited to speak about Allah without knowledge, and included within that is to give him a name or to give him an attribute that he didn't affirm for himself, because now then we will be falling into something which is prohibited. Now, there is some clarification here, because the Shaykh clarifies in his commentary, and he says, even though we cannot name Allah and we cannot ascribe to Allah an attribute that he did not ascribe to himself, nevertheless we can inform about Allah, we can make ikhbar about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with respect to his actions which he does. With respect to his actions which he does. So, and this is because the actions of Allah are from his attributes. And the Shaykh gives us a number of examples to illustrate this point very clearly. For example, if we were to say Allah is the Sani', which means the maker, as-Sani'. Even though this isn't an actual name, we see in the Quran that Allah Azza wa Jal has said, صُنْعَ اللَّهِ الَّذِي أَتْقَنَ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ. Right? It is the sun'a, which is the creation of Allah, what Allah made. The one who is the most precise in everything, exact in everything. So we know that Allah, that He sana'a, that He does, that He makes. So purely from the angle of describing the action of Allah, we can say Allah is sani'. There's nothing wrong with this, right? Because this isn't speaking about Allah without knowledge. It's simply describing Him with an attribute, describing Him with an attribute on the basis of an action that is established for Him, which He established for Himself. Right? A second example to make this clear is the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal when He said, وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا. وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا. Right? Allah spoke to Moses with direct speech. كَلَّمَ اللَّهُ وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا. Here, كَلَّمَ, Allah speaks. Allah speaks. So therefore we can say Allah is mutakallim. Allah is mutakallim. Even though there is no name of Allah, that Allah is al-mutakallim. Al-mutakallim. Right? There is no name in the Quran or the Sunnah that Allah ascribed to Himself that He is al-mutakallim. However, here we are not saying Allah is mutakallim as in that He is named al-mutakallim. We are speaking here as a description of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of an action that He does. So He is mutakallim because He yatakallam, He speaks. Right? And we can say Allah is sani'. He is the maker, the doer, because He does, He makes. And likewise, we can say, as we see another example, وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ يَفْعَلُ مَا يُرِيدُ. وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ يَفْعَلُ مَا يُرِيدُ. However, Allah, He does whatever He wishes. So Allah Azza wa Jal, yurid. Allah wishes, Allah desires. So we can say Allah is murid. Allah is one who wishes. We are not saying Allah is. We are not saying that Allah Azza wa Jal is al-murid as a name. No, this is simply describing Allah by way of an action that He does. He has irada, He yurid, he desires, he wishes, so therefore he is murid. Right? Now all of these names and labels, there is nothing within them that is inherently evil. Right? Murid, irad, to have irada. To have an irada isn't evil in and of itself. Right? Likewise, sani', likewise, kalam, to speak, and takallum, to speak. This is not inherently evil. So these descriptions, as long as they do not contain anything which is inherently evil, then the scholars say that it is permissible for us to inform and to speak about Allah, subhanahu wa ta'ala by way of these, descriptions. We can make ikhbar about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by way of these descriptions. So this is a clarification. This is a clarification then, that when we say it is not permissible to give Allah a name or to give Allah an attribute that He Himself did not give to Himself, then there are some examples which are very, very clear. As I said, Allah is not the Father, Al-Ab, right? Allah is not the prime mover, like the philosophers say. Right? These are not names which He named for Himself. That's one thing. And the other thing is that excluded from this principle is to describe Allah on the basis of actions He does. So Allah is murid, Allah is, mutakallim, Allah is the sani', and there are, others. Allah is a shay. Allah is a thing. We can say Allah is a thing, right? Because of evidences in the Quran. Qul ayyu shay'in akbaru shahadatin. Which thing is greater in testimony? And the verse goes on to mention that, obviously it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah is a thing. So we can say Allah is a thing. It doesn't mean a name or, right? So there are many other examples like this. So we have to make a distinction, therefore, between what is actually prohibited and between what is permissible, because it's simply describing Allah by way of actions He does or by way of what He Himself mentioned without it actually being a name in and of itself, right? So this is the second thing that it is not permissible for us to do, to name Allah with a name or attribute that He did not name Himself with obviously the clarification that we just provided. The third thing that is not permissible, وَلَا يَجُوزُ إِثْبَاتُ إِسْمٍ أَوْ صِفَةٍ لِلَّهِ تَعَالَى مَعَ التَّمْثِيلِ. Right? It is not permissible for us to affirm any name or attribute for Allah with tamthil, by likening, making a likeness for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. Clear evidence, there is nothing which is a likeness unto Him. He is all hearing, all seeing. فَلَا تَضْرِبُوا لِلَّهِ الْأَمْثَالِ. Do not set up for Allah any likenesses. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Indeed, Allah knows and you do not know. So this verse is very clear and explicit. Surah Al-Nahl, Surah 16, verse 74. Right? It is impermissible for us to set up likenesses, similitudes for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And because, as the Shaykh says, وَلِأَنَّ ذَلِكَ إِشْرَاكٌ بِاللَّهِ تَعَالَى يَسْتَلْزِمُ تَحْرِيفَ النُّصُوصِ أَوْ تَكْذِيبَهَا مع تنقص الله تعالى بتمثيله بالمخلوق الناقص. Right? Because this, if you describe Allah with something and you make a likeness for Allah, then you have committed shirk with Allah, because you've now made someone a partner to Allah in that name or that description. And also you have ascribed deficiency and flaw to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the sense that you've ascribed to him what the creation is described with, or the reality that the creation is described with. Right? So this is impermissible. This is the third thing. And the Shaykh was on to explain some of the reasons or some of the wisdoms behind this, why this is tanaqqus, why this is wrong. And he says, first of all, as we just mentioned, it is ishrak billahi ta'ala. You are essentially committing shirk with Allah, because you are likening something from the creation to Allah in that reality. So if you say Allah's hearing is like our hearing, Allah's seeing is like our seeing, Allah's love is like our love, Allah's anger is like our anger, right? All of this now is you are making a likeness for Allah, and this is shirk with Allah in al-asma'i wa sifat. It's not permissible. Secondly, this necessitates distorting the text, because this tamthil that you made is not what the text indicates, right? This tamthil you brought from yourself. So even if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's affirmed in the text that Allah, for example, that He loves, or that He's pleased, and you say that His love and pleasure is like our love and pleasure, well, the text did not come with that meaning. The text did not come with that meaning. You've took that meaning and you've applied it to the text. You are saying that this is what the text. So now this is tahriful ma'na. You are distorting the meaning of the text, right? This is the second crime, or the second thing that you fall into. And the third thing is you are making tanaqqus. You are diminishing the greatness of Allah, because you are attributing to Him shortcoming, deficiency, flaws. When you say Allah's seeing is like our seeing, He must see like how we see. Well, you are now ascribing the deficiency of the reality of your seeing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You've now made it a deficiency for Allah in His sight, and you've made a deficiency for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in general. So this now is tanaqqus. This now is the third thing that you fall into when you make tamthil for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is prohibited. And also, the Shaykh actually gives an example from some poetry, and he says, he quotes the poetry, "Alam tara anna sayf yanqusu qadrahu idha qila inna sayf amdha min al-asa." Right? So he says, look, imagine that you say that when you say about a sword, that this sword is sharper than a staff made of wood. Like you are comparing the sword to wood, right? Simply by comparing it to wood, you've actually made the sword to be deficient, right? Because, which sword? You're saying this sword is sharper than a piece of wood? Well, it can't really be a very sharp sword then, can it? Right? So by making that likeness, you've diminished the worth of the actual sword, even though it might be the sharpest sword ever. All right? So in the same way, this is what happens with tamthil. When you make a likeness for Allah from within His creation, for His names or His attributes, you've diminished Him. And we already established in verses previously, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. To Allah belongs the loftiest attribute. To Allah belongs the highest attribute, which means that really we cannot make comparisons. We cannot give similitudes for Allah, because He is beyond similitudes in His names and His attributes. Right? So anyhow, this is the third thing that we are not allowed to do in the topic of the attributes. The fourth thing we are not allowed to do, ولا يجوز إثبات اسم أو صفة لله تعالى مع التكييف. We are not allowed to affirm for Allah any name or attribute while making takyif, which is now to specify from ourselves that the attribute is like this, or it is like this, or it is like this. Right? This is takyif now. This is now to bring something from yourself and say, well, I think it's like this. I think Allah's, hearing is like this. I think Allah's seeing is like this. I think Allah's face is like this. I think Allah's hand is like this. This now is takyif. You are specifying how. لأن ذلك قول على الله تعالى بلا علم. Because this also is to speak about Allah without knowledge. And he says, يستلزم الفوضى والتخبط في صفات الله تعالى. This leads to chaos, confusion, and stumbling and making mistakes when it comes to, when it comes to the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And because what will happen, as the Shaykh says, إذ كل واحد يتخيل كيفية معينة غير ما يتخيله الآخر. Everybody will start to imagine and think, of a specific kayfiyah. Right? One will say, I think Allah's hearing is like this. Another one will say, well, I think Allah's hearing is like this. Because everyone's imagination is different. And they will come to different, different ideas and views. And also, وَلِأَنَّ ذَلِكَ مُحَاوَلَةٌ لِإِدْرَاكِ مَا لَا يُمْكِنْ إِدْرَاكُهُ بِالْعُقُولِ. And also because this is a person trying to comprehend something that is incomprehensible with the intellects. Right? We cannot comprehend the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because there is nothing in the creation which is a likeness for the attributes of Allah. So to be able to imagine and to comprehend these realities is something incomprehensible. So this means to actually make takyif, to specify a takyif, a how, that is impossible. That is impossible. And no matter how much you try to imagine or estimate, فَاللَّهُ أَعْلَى وَأَعْظَمُ. Allah is actually higher and greater than whatever you try to imagine and you try to think. Right? So these are four things that the Shaykh rahimahullah has mentioned. So at the beginning, what did we establish? We established the general universal principle of the people of Tawheed and Sunnah as it comes to Allah's attributes. Okay? We affirm for Allah what He affirmed for Himself or His Messenger affirmed for Him without tahrif, ta'til, takyif, tamthil. Then the Shaykh elaborated upon that by mentioning four things we are not allowed to do. Number one, we can't negate anything which Allah ascribed to Himself. Secondly, we can't name Allah with a name or attribute that He did not give to Himself. And then we made an exception for those things, for those attributes or titles or names or whatever that are permissible to use, like murid, mutakallim, sani' and things like that. The third thing that we can't do is to affirm for Allah any name or attribute with tamthil. And the fourth thing that we can't do is to affirm for Allah a name or attribute with takyif. Right? From here the Shaykh now goes on to basically summarize all of the possible views that a person can have on the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is again from Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. And so basically there are 6 positions and 6 views. And inshallah we'll conclude our lesson with the rest of this discussion. So Shaykh goes on to say that وهذا النوع من التوحيد هو الذي كثر فيه الخوض بين أهل القبلة فانقسموا في النصوص الواردة فيه إلى 6 أقسام. He says this type of tawheed is the one in which there has been much dispute and disputation between the people of the Qibla. And so they have divided in terms of how they approach the texts of the attributes, they have divided into 6 groups. There are 6 groups. Right? And this actually is a very good classification from Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah. It very nicely summarizes every attitude, every opinion, and puts it into 6 clear categories, right, in terms of the people and where they stand in relation to the names and attributes. So we'll go through each of these one by one, inshaAllah ta'ala. So the first one, al-qism al-awwal, من أجروها على ظاهرها اللائق بالله تعالى من غير تحريف ولا تعطيل ولا تكييف ولا تمثيل وهؤلاء هم السلف وهذا هو الصواب المقطوع به لدلالة الكتاب والسنة والعقل والإجماع السابق عليه دلالة قطيعة أو ذنية. Okay, so he says, the first are those who take these texts and they take them on their apparentness in a way that befits Allah the Exalted. Right? So they take these texts, they understand them in accordance with the clear Arabic language upon the apparent meaning, and they, in a way that befits the majesty of Allah, in a way that is befitting for Allah, and without falling into tahrif, which is distortion, or ta'til, which is negation, or takyif, which is asking how, or tamthil, which is to make a likeness for Allah, right? So in accordance with what we just mentioned, they are the Salaf. This is the way of the Salaf, this is the way of the Sahaba. And this is what is correct, and which is, firmly established by evidence of the Quran and the Sunnah and intellect, and a previous consensus which existed amongst the companions and amongst the Salaf, with definitive evidences or preponderant evidences. Basically, this is the first view. This is the first stance. The first stance that we take is basically along the following lines: that when we read the Quran and we see that Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, for example, Ar-Rahmanu ala al-Arshi istawa, Allah ascended above the throne. Or Allah says, Bal yadahu mabsutatan, that both the hands of Allah are outstretched. Or Allah says, وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ, or whatever Allah might whatever is similar, that the face of your Lord, possessed of might and honor, will remain, right? So we read these texts, and so we say that we take what they mean in the clear Arabic language, that Allah has a face, that Allah ascended above the throne, that Allah becomes pleased, Allah becomes angry. So we clearly affirm these things because Allah knows best of Himself, and Allah is the one who said these things, and Allah clearly mentioned these things as actual attributes. This is undeniable. So we will believe in them upon what is apparent in the language, but in a way that befits the majesty of Allah. So these attributes of Allah are unlike the attributes of the creation, right? Allah's essence is unlike our essence, right? So therefore there cannot be any likeness between what Allah described for Himself and between what we are described with, right? And we will then affirm and believe in all of this without now denying any of this or start distorting any of this by making faulty metaphorical interpretations, or by trying to claim that Allah's attributes are like those of the creation, or trying to specify a form or a how for Allah's attributes, because we have no knowledge of that to begin with, right? So this is something we should all be clear about. Previously we gave many examples to illustrate the point. The jinn, we can't see the jinn. The jinn are made of an essence that we don't really understand, but the jinn have attributes, the jinn do actions, the jinn have properties, the jinn have attributes, they have a face, they hear, they see, they speak, but we have absolutely no idea how that actually is. And even though we might try to imagine in our minds how it is, the reality is other than it, right? So if we can accept that to two things between the creation, that they can be described with the same names and attributes yet be totally unlike each other, then even more so between Allah and His creation, right? So there is no reason, there's no any rational reason why Allah's names and attributes should be rejected, right? And this is, as the Shaykh said, it is proven, this view, this stance is proven by the Quran, by the Sunnah, by reason, by intellect, and by a previous consensus that existed among the Sahaba and the Salaf, even though people differed afterwards, right? So anyway, that's the first position, the first view. It is the correct view and the correct position towards the attributes. The second orientation, القسم الثاني الذين القسم الثاني من أجروها على ظاهرها لكن جعلوها من جنس صفات المخلوقين وهؤلاء هم الممثلة ومذهبهم باطل بالكتاب والسنة والعقل وإنكار السلف. Second group now are those who look at the texts and they take them upon the apparent meaning, but they make them to be just like the generality of the attributes of the creation. And they are the mumathila, they are the ones who we say, they are the likeners, the ones who liken Allah's attributes to those of the creation. And their doctrine is futile and false by judgment of the book and the sunnah and reason, intellect, and through rejection of the salaf. So in other words, what do these people do? These people look at the texts of the Quran and the Sunnah. Allah has a face, Allah has a hand, Allah loves, Allah is pleased, Allah becomes angry. And they say, well, the only way we know these attributes is by way of what we see in the creation. And so the only way Allah can actually have these attributes is that they must be similar, they must resemble, they must be similar to what we see in the creation. So they make a similitude, a likeness for Allah. This is false. This doctrine is false. And historically speaking, this occurred among some of the sects of the Shia. The Shia are the ones who basically made tamthil and tajseem for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But this was like really a short-lived doctrine. And eventually the Shia, they abandoned that and they then went into the way of the Mu'tazila, right, which is to reject the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But nevertheless, if there are people like this who exist and say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like His creatures, then this madhab is batil, it is futile and false. This now is the second orientation, it is false. The third orientation is القسم الثالث من أجروها على خلاف ظاهرها وعينوا لها معاني بعقولهم وحرفوا من أجلها النصوص وهؤلاء هم أهل التعطيل فمنهم من عطل تعطيلا كبيرا كالجهمي والمعتزلة ونحوهم ومنهم من عطل دون ذلك كالأشاعرة. The third group now are those who look at the attributes and they do not accept them upon the apparent meaning, but they start inventing their own meanings for these texts from their own intellects. And they start distorting the texts, right? So for example, they come across the ayah in the Quran about the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the anger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they say, this doesn't mean anger. This just means Allah's intention to punish. So they explain away the attribute. Right? It means Allah's irada to punish, Allah's desire to punish. It's not Allah's anger, because Allah doesn't become angry because anger is a human. They start giving all these rationalities, right? So they alter the meaning. They bring a meaning from themselves, and they then start distorting the text, even though the text says one thing. For example, Allah loves the mutatahhirin, the ones who purify themselves. Allah loves, his believing servants. They say, no, Allah can't love because love is a human emotion which is flawed and defective. It's a sign of weakness. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who clearly established for himself that he loves. So where are you getting this from? Right? So then they will invent another meaning and distort the actual text. Right? So this is the way of the Mu'attila. They are the ones who deny the attributes and then they distort the texts. And there are some amongst them who do it a great deal, such as the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila. Right? So they deny all the attributes, all the names, right? And they make a tremendous amount of distortion and alteration of the texts. And amongst them are those who do it only partially or somewhat to a certain degree. So they are the likes of the Kullabiyah, the Asha'ira, the Maturidiyah, right? So they deny some attributes as opposed to others. And so they fall into this to a lesser degree. This now is the third group, or the third orientation, right? This is their take on the attributes. And again, we discussed this previously in greater detail. Right, now we have the remaining three groups, and generally, the remaining three groups, you will see, their position is really, what their position is that they really are being kind of indifferent. They're not really too keen on this topic of names and attributes. They don't want to delve into it. They don't want to know what the truth is. And they'll start having like a general position of just, well, we don't really want to delve too much, right? So the fourth group now, al-qism al-rabi', man qalu Allahu a'lamu bima arada biha wa fawwadu ilma ma'aniha ila Allah wahdahu wa ha'ula'i hum ahlu at-tajhil al-mufawwida wa tanaqada ba'duhum فقال الله أعلم بما أراد لكنه لم يرد إثبات صفة خارجية له تعالى. So this group, what does this group say? They say Allah knows best with what He intends by these verses. For example, Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arsh istawa. Allah ascended above the throne, right? بل يداه مبسوطتان, right? Allah's hands both His hands are outstretched, or Allah descends to the lowest heaven, or Allah is amazed or laughs at the man, right? They say Allah knows best. We don't know. Allah knows best what He means by these texts. We don't really know. And they say that we leave the meanings of these to Allah. We leave the meanings of what they mean to Allah. So, in other words, what these people are really saying, if you think about what they are saying that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu, when he conveyed these texts, when he recited these verses, when he conveyed these texts, he himself was wholly ignorant of what he was conveying. He did not know what he was conveying, right? So when he said, when he recited the Quran, for example, and Allah mentions His anger and His pleasure and His face, and that He ascended above the throne, right? The Messenger was completely and wholly ignorant of what these verses actually meant, and he conveyed them to his ummah in such a way, right? So therefore, when we read these texts, then the only approach to these texts is to say Allah knows best what He means. We have no idea what the meaning of these verses are. Right? بَلْ يَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَةً. We have no idea what this actually means. Only Allah knows the actual meanings. So, this statement is like from the most evil statements, because it is imputing ignorance to the prophets and messengers in what they are conveying from their Lord about their Lord. Right? It is the most evil type of statement. And then the Shaykh goes on to say that they actually do contradict themselves also. Amongst themselves, they contradict themselves. they say, well, Allah knows best what it means, but it doesn't mean an attribute. Right? Right? But it's not an attribute. Okay, well, how do you know that then? Because you've just said Allah knows best what it means. How can you say, we have no idea what this verse means, Allah knows best, but it's not an attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Right? بَلْ يَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ. Allah knows best what it means. We have no idea. The messenger conveyed it, had no idea what it means, but it's not an attribute. Well, that's a contradiction then. Well, how can you now say we don't know what it means, Allah knows best what it means, and now you're denying it as an attribute? We can't say that. This is a contradiction. Anyhow, this is the first of the last three groups. The second of these last three groups, القسم الخامس من قالوا يجوز أن يكون المراد بهذه النصوص إثبات صفة تليق بالله تعالى وألا يكون المراد ذلك وهؤلاء كثير من الفقهاء وغيرهم. Now the next group is even more like they're trying to be even more how can I put it, aloof from the topic, right? So they say it is possible and permissible that what is intended by these texts is to affirm an attribute for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It could be that, but it could also not be the case, meaning that yes, we look at these texts, so they come across the text and they read the text, Ar-Rahmanu al-Arsh istawa bal yadahu mabsutatan, and so on and so forth, and they say, oh yeah, this could be an attribute, but it might not be an attribute. So in other words, this now is even more of a shaky, it's like not really a firm position. It's like a shaky position. You're showing that you're not really committed to holding a real firm position in this topic. You just want to kind of be evasive, and you want to not really, delve in this topic. Oh yes, it could be an attribute, but might not be an attribute. We don't know, right? So this is the fifth group, and finally the sixth group. The Shaykh goes on to say, القسم السادس من أعرضوا بقلوبهم وأمسكوا بألسنتهم عن هذا كله واقتصروا على قراءة النصوص ولم يقولوا فيها بشيء. Right, now the sixth group are those who turn away completely with their hearts from this topic. They withhold their tongues from speaking about any of this, and all they do is just read the text, and that's it. Meaning, read the text as an act of worship, as an act of ibadah, right? And they do not utter any speech about it, right? So to them, it's like they're reading the Quran, Taha, for example, they read the Surah Taha, and they read the Surah, and they come to Ar-Rahmanu ala al-Arsh istawa, or whatever the verse might be found in other parts of the Quran, ثم استوى على العرش, right, in other parts of the in other verses, and they read it and they just go through it, and it won't mean anything to them, right? And so there's nothing in this verse or similar verses that warrants any attention in relation to Allah's names and attributes. They just move on, and they'll turn away with their hearts and with their tongues from any discussion of the topic altogether. Right? This is the sixth group of people that you find in relation to this topic. So this kind of summarizes the various positions that can be taken on Allah's names and His attributes. And this brings us to the end of this section and the end of today's lesson, really. So just to put everything into context then, up until now, we've looked at Tawheed, which is the foundation of Islam, the general Islam of every prophet and messenger, and the specific Islam of the messenger of Islam, Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we find that Tawheed in the Sharia has been discussed in and clarified in such a detailed, very clear, very lucid way, in a way that we do not find with the Yahud or with the Nasara or with the people who claim to have a book from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all ambiguity is removed. We know clearly what is Tawheed, what can be ascribed to Allah, and what clashes with Tawheed and what cannot be ascribed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So all of this is clear and apparent. However, from this point, we need to distinguish what we've discussed so far. So far, you should have a very clear understanding of what is the Tawheed of the messengers. Right. From here, starting from the next lesson, we are going to look at how some of the people of Kalam, the people of philosophy, they came with a different rendition of Tawheed, different to the one that we've just discussed. Right? This is the people of Kalam, this is the people of philosophy. So whereas we have, Allah is one and unique in His actions, Rububiyyah, Allah is unique and one in His uluhiyyah, meaning deserving to be worshipped with all forms and types of worship. Allah is one and unique in His names and attributes. Right? They have a slightly different rendition, which is false, and it doesn't establish the actual Tawheed of the messengers. Right? This what we've discussed, this Tawheed that we've discussed, when you understand it in this way, because it is from the Quran, it establishes the actual Tawheed that the messengers came to establish. And all the benefits that arise from that follow on from that. But these people, the people of philosophy, the people of Kalam, they have a slightly different rendition. And I'll mention it very briefly here. Allah is one in His essence and He has no division. Allah is one in His attributes and He has nothing to resemble Him. And Allah is one in His actions. It seems to be the same as what we are saying, does it not? Right? So you've heard these statements. Allah is one in His actions. Allah is one in His essence, in His that. Allah is one in His attributes. It seems to be the same as what we've just said on the surface. But what do they actually mean by these statements? What do they mean by these statements? And is that the Tawheed that the prophets and messengers actually call to? So just because on the surface they are saying Allah is one in His essence, Allah is one in His attributes, Allah is one in His actions. That's what they're saying in the wording. But is that really the Tawheed that we see from the Quran? Or are they giving some philosophical rendition that they've taken from Aristotle, Plato, Democritus and other from the Greek philosophers, and then they're trying to justify that understanding by distorting the verses of the Quran, right? So to see that clear distinction between the Tawheed that we've just discussed in the previous 4, 5, 6 lessons, and between what they are trying to say, this is what we are going to embark upon in the lessons to follow, insha'Allah ta'ala, which is why it's important to grasp what we've been discussing in the previous lessons, before we come to this section or this topic in the next lesson, insha'Allah ta'ala. So with that, we'll conclude our lesson there for today. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.